talk to you about affirmative action in higher education in contemporary Brazil. So basically what first drew me to this topic was part of our class with Professor Delgado was this portion called News, where we would bring in news articles that we found on contemporary policy issues in Latin America. And the first week of class, I found an article in the New York Times that talked about this law of social quotas that had been passed in Brazil in August of 2012. And the New York Times called it one of the Western Hemisphere's most sweeping affirmative action laws. And I immediately became interested in the topic and wanted to learn more about it. And so today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about where this law fits in the context of Latin America, higher education reform, and education reform in general in the region. And then within Brazil itself, what affirmative action has looked like in Brazil up to this point. I'm also going to talk about critical reception of this most recent law. As we all know, affirmative action is a very controversial topic, and it has received lots of opinions from both sides of the issue. And then talk about its potential impact as a policy for the future of higher education in Brazil. And so to start, what I have here is the title from the May of 2011 ECOSOC, which is the United Nations Economic and Social Council. They produced a report on key education challenges in Latin America and the Caribbean, teacher equality and equity. I'm of course looking at the third problem, which is equity, or the equality of access to education, which is an issue that affirmative action addresses. And so the report talks about this lack of equalizing opportunities. There's another report produced by the Inter-American Development Bank, there's the ECOSOC logo, which distinguishes between equality and equity. It makes this important distinction that equality is the difference in educational outcomes for subgroups, boys versus girls, urban versus rural, whereas equity specifically addresses the equality of access to education. And so some regional responses to this equity issue in recent years in Latin America have been universal primary education, the increased funding for education, disseminating education to rural areas. This is especially prominent in Mexico. And then, of course, the topic of today, affirmative action, which we can see in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. And so before I get into this, I want to talk a little bit about what affirmative action is. Everybody knows something about it, but just to kind of establish what we're talking about when we say affirmative action. Merriam-Webster defines it as an active effort to improve the employment or educational opportunities of members of minority groups and women. Seems like a rather cut and dry definition. We all know that it's not. It's an incredibly controversial topic. Those who are against affirmative action argue that it's reverse discrimination, that by giving opportunities to the minority, you're in fact discriminating against those who do not benefit from affirmative action policies. They also argue that it devalues the merit system because, especially in the case of higher education, you are allowing somebody to get into a meritocracy, a meritorious institution, on qualities other than merit. And also, speaking to universities, they say that it harms beneficiaries because while you are increasing the equality of access and allowing people who had previously been marginalized from universities to enter, you're almost setting them up to fail because they're not qualified to be in the university and therefore cannot succeed in the university. Those who are in favor of affirmative action argue that it isn't reverse discrimination, but in fact compensation for years, decades, centuries of discrimination, racism, and sexism. And that affirmative action brings about equal representation, which should exist in democratic institutions, and has not, left to its own devices, developed yet, especially in Brazil and in these universities. And they do also argue that in a university setting, part of the goal of an academic institution is to have a diverse discourse, to be able to draw from different backgrounds. And the goal is that affirmative action will bring in this diversity of discourse and improve and enrich the academic experience in the university. And of course, there's the debate over quotas, which is a specific piece of affirmative action policy, kind of under the umbrella, which is what the law of social quotas addresses specifically. And it's the debate over whether or not you can put a number on equality, and whether you can put a number on equity, and whether you can actually quantify who is allowed to come in and who isn't. And so, talking about the case study, inequity in Brazilian higher education, Brazil's only black senator made this comment in a PBS interview that in Brazil, poverty has a color, and that color is black. Some facts to corroborate his statement. In 2010, the census discovered that Afro-descended Brazilians who are known as Pagu, brown, or Preto, black, who identify as non-white, made up 70% of the lowest income decile and only 15% of the highest, despite the fact that they make up roughly half of Brazil's population. In addition, there is a 20% illiteracy rate among non-whites, as versus an 8% of whites. I have a map here that shows you Brazil, the yellow being the lowest literacy rates and the dark blue being the highest. And if you're familiar with Brazil, you're familiar with geography, you know where non-whites are concentrated in those yellow areas. Also, speaking specifically to inequity in education, Brazil, it starts early. In your formative years, if you come from a relatively wealthy family, which, based on these statements, you're more likely to be white, your parents will pay for you to go to a private school where you're prepared to take the university entrance exam, which is known as the vestibular, which is a very rigorous exam, and only the highest scores are allowed to get into the best universities, which in Brazil are the federal public universities. The federal public universities whose tuition is paid for by the government. So these students are prepared from a very young age, and then they're allowed free university education. For a student that enters the public schools, they do receive free formative education, but the public schools are plagued by a chronic lack of resources, a lack of human capital, and as you saw in that ECOSOC report at the beginning, the other two issues are teachers and quality, both of which Brazil currently lacks. And so these students are not adequately prepared to take the vestibular, and are therefore either forced to attend private universities, which are of a lower quality, but require you to pay tuition, which if you went to public school, you might not have the money to do, or you can't even get into university at all. And so one way that Brazil has decided to address this issue of equity is by making affirmative action, by taking these public and federal universities and requiring them to reserve a certain number of seats for students from public schools and for students of color. But one thing that's particularly challenging about race policy, or racial policy in Brazil, is this idea of racial democracy. This idea of creating a race-based policy in a country where race means so many different things. It's an incredibly complex issue. Up until recently, there is this idea of racial democracy that we are a culture of miscegenation. All of us are white, all of us are black, we are all mixed. And so it begs the question of who is black in Brazil. There was a study done that looked at these different ways you could classify yourself. You could self-classify as race for the census, or the interviewer could describe a race. There's the researcher's gaze, ancestry, whether you're considered black by the black movement, and what your photo looks like. And so these are the results that they had. As you can see, it's very challenging to nail down exactly what it means to be black or non-white in Brazil. And so to attempt to make a law that makes quotas for these people is equally challenging. And so to give you a brief history of what affirmative action has looked like in Brazil, before 2001 there was no, at least in higher education, there was no law, no bill, no really policy talking about affirmative action. It had been mentioned before, but it wasn't until the fall of 2001 that the State University of Rio de Janeiro implemented a quota. They had previously implemented a 50% quota, reserving half of their seats for students from public schools. And then they added a 40% corollary saying of those 50%, 40% must be Padua. This was met with immediate opposition. There were 300 lawsuits filed by students who were not beneficiaries of the quotas, and every one of them received injunctions. They were allowed to go to the university, despite the fact that some of them would not have been admitted to the university independent of the quotas based on merit. And in 2003, the quotas were reduced at the threat of an injunction from the Supreme Court, who would declare the quotas unconstitutional. There was a threat for a lawsuit. Nevertheless, dozens of other schools begin to follow Rio de Janeiro's example. And in 2004, the first federal university creates a racial quota. The University of Brasilia, because the government hadn't really made a decision by this point, they worked independently to create this quota, which was designed to reserve 20% of seats for Padus e Pretos. And the way they would decide this would be a phenotypic test. You would apply to the university and send in a photo with your application, and a subcommittee of the admissions committee would look at this photo and decide whether or not your claim that you are Padua Preto was in fact correct. You could imagine that this was controversial, and in fact, in 2007, there was a case where identical twins applied to the University of Brasilia. One of them was declared white and therefore ineligible for the quota, while the other one was declared Padua. and was admitted on the quota. Nevertheless, in 2012, the constitutionality of this quota was upheld, which was a big move, and then you begin to see this law of social quotas coming around. Since 2008, Congress passes a bill asking for social quotas, asking for, especially in the university. And then in 2012, we see this law passed, which reserves 50% of seats in all 59 federal universities in Brazil for students who come from public schools. And of that, 12.5% must be Padre Treto, and priority is given to the rest of those seats for Padre Treto. And so I looked a little bit at this critical reception, mostly in the news because it's such a new thing. I really was just looking at how people were reacting in the public sphere. One man that you see in favor, President Lula, who says, try finding a black doctor, a black dentist, a black bank manager, and you will encounter great difficulty in Brazil. He was quoted saying that it's time for Brazil to make this move. Then there's a professor from Fordham University who notes that before the enactment of the law, there were at least 80 public universities that had adopted affirmative action, and studies from these universities show that it is working. And so she came out in favor of these programs because she believes that when implemented at a federal level, they will be successful. Nevertheless, there were some that were against it. This is former President Cardoso, who says that it is important to compensate people, but the way that we do that cannot be a copy of what has been done in one moment in the U.S. And this is actually a point that comes up a lot, is that in the United States, racism was institutionalized, and therefore it makes sense that we have institutional reform. But in Brazil, racism was never institutionalized. There was always that idea of racial democracy, a culture of miscegenation. It was never one-drop rule, segregation du jour. And therefore, he says, I think it's better to leave more freedom for universities to show how to adjust, rather than attempting to institutionalize it at a federal level. Those who argue in favor would say that the universities have had time to adjust, and yet the empirical data still suggests that there is discrimination occurring. But, and then The Economist came out with a quote that says, racism in such a mixed country has different implications than the country of the United States. The greatest differences in Brazil are regional and socioeconomic, suggesting that, if anything, laws like this should be focused on socioeconomic differences rather than racial differences. And so this begs the question of, where do we go from here? What is this policy doing? What has it done? And what more can it do? What potential does it have? And so one thing that affirmative action has done, bar none, has opened channels of communication about race in Brazil. Because before this, there had really been no acknowledgement, at least at the government level, of the fact that despite the empirical data suggesting that there is discrimination occurring, there was no real forum for them to be, for the Black movement, for Afro-descendants to be able to talk about this. And so because this has been acknowledged at the level of the federal government, there's now room for dialogue about the issue of whether or not racism exists in Brazil. Affirmative action does address the equity issue. It does provide a way for students who had previously been marginalized and previously not had the opportunity to even access education, to even be given the chance to succeed, now have it. However, it doesn't solve the problem of education in Brazil. This quote I found, the dire side of using quotas as a mechanism of affirmative action gives the impression that all evident deficiencies of the public basic education system are solved. The threat of quotas here is not what they're doing, but what they don't do. It's very easy for a government to offer a solution, put a Band-Aid on it, and then walk away, especially with everything that Brazil is dealing with right now in terms of big infrastructure that they have to build for big events coming up. Education is very easily pushed to the back. And coming out with such a momentous law, something that's so big, it would be easy to be like, look, we've made this huge progress, now let's go focus on something else. But in reality, just because they're getting into the universities doesn't mean that they're prepared to succeed. There needs to be addressing the problem at a more comprehensive level. Affirmative action, I believe, should be part of a temporary solution, part of a timeline that is part of a more comprehensive package that seeks to more thoroughly address the glaring problems of inequality of education and low quality, low teachers, and low human capital, low resources. Brazil needs to address all these issues in sort of a long-term way. And at the same time, affirmative action is a corollary to this idea of a policy package, because it solves the problems of discrimination until that point where Afro-descendants can reach those indicators that they can succeed in school, at which point the quotas will no longer be necessary.